Hello, I'm Rebecca Rodriguez with Sunwest Communications, and welcome to our midterm election 22 recap with our LuncefordWEBB Government Relations team. I'm happy to introduce them to you now. Brinton Payne joining us now, and Michael Lunceford and Jay Barksdale. Welcome, guys. Looking forward to this conversation today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your roles here and what we'll be talking about today.
I'm new to the LuncefordWEBB family, thanks to my old colleague, Jay Barksdale, and so I'm glad to be here. I'm from the western side of the Metroplex, Tarrant County, and plan to talk a little bit about the election results from Tarrant County, as well as maybe on the national and statewide scale. So thank you.
I'm Michael Lunceford, and happy to be here with my wonderful colleagues.
I'm Jay Barksdale, and I'm glad to be here as well.
Interesting night watching the election returns, coming in certainly across the country, and locally as well across the state.
Yeah, I think for me it was kind of what was to be expected. There was a lot of talk about a big red wave, and I don't think that was really seen as much. And at least locally, it seemed to be that. There was a little bit of a toss-up on what was going to happen at our county judge level. And I think the only real surprises might have been in our county commissioner's court seat, the second precinct there. But for the most part, it seemed to be not anything that was overly dramatic, but just, where there were a couple of races that were interesting. But for the most part, what everyone seemed to kind of settle in and expect, at least coming from my point of view, that's kind of more of a personal opinion.
I would say the one thing that I found interesting was that the national narrative on election day was different than the Texas narrative. Because if you look at Texas, all the statewide candidates, Republican candidates, won very handily. They all won by double digits. And I thought that was quite remarkable. They also grew the Republican majority in the Texas House by adding one member, so you're going to be at 86. There was also an added member to the Texas congressional delegation. And there was a growth in the number of Republican Hispanic women in Texas. And Texas continues to be a beacon of economic opportunity and prosperity, and a place where people continue to come and want to grow their business and grow their families, and we've all seen that.
Yeah, I agree. No big surprises across Texas. Maybe the margin of victory by some of the statewide was very strong, like Michael said, over double digits. So that's an explanation point for Republicans in Texas.
One of the things that I want to ask you about, though, Brinton, a few years back, it wasn't that long ago, last election cycle, there was talk about Tarrant County turning purple and the influence necessarily, of Democrats there. That wasn't even close.
No, that was really the thought at a time. And I think it is still a very large hotbed, for national politics as well as local. I think, what I looked at as kind of the precursor to leading up to this race in Tarrant County was obviously the primary elections, but then also some of the school, the ISD and school board races. And if you look at, if really where the voting came from in Tarrant County, we don't really have a suburban Tarrant County as much anymore. I mean, we're all growing into this large metropolis, if you will, or metro area. But in the core is more of the Democratic voting, and in the outsides, there's more of the Republican. And if you looked at a lot of those school districts races, including all of the northeast and northwest Tarrant County, that seemed to be where the strength of the voter was, and that was what made me, look at, okay, this may be Tim O'Hare's to lose in this regard. But if you look at our numbers too, we've had things as low as a 3% voter turnout on local elections. We had 46.96% voter turnout. So not perfect, not anywhere near over half, but the numbers are getting up, and I would say that elections are becoming more and more popular. I mean, it's good to see voter turnout no matter which way the elections go, and I think that's helpful in all forms of government, is just to get out there and vote.
You mentioned something really interesting, and you mentioned school board elections. How are school board elections driving narratives today in a way that I've never seen before?
Mike, do you want to take that?
Well, frankly, I think there was an awakening, so to speak, 18 months ago in South Lake, for example, where there was a lot of focus on the school board election, and we've seen that with parents in other counties in the United States, Fairfax County, Virginia, for example. And I think that that's something that is making a difference, that you've got a lot more people who are engaged now and understand that the local elections are very important to them, and particularly on the school board side.
And there seems to be also, I mean, if you do look at the one in South Lake, there were a few individuals who presumably were not happy with the way things were going at the school board level, created a PAC, that then became very instrumental in the county judges race there in Tarrant County. So you can see where this grassroots is really beginning to grow. And I would also argue that, everybody has politics 24/7 on their phones now. So if you want to reach out there and get out the folks and get the messaging out, there's very effective means in doing so. And so I think we're in a constant reel of that media attention, even if it's made from our own home bedroom or wherever the podcast is made.
We were talking about previously, kind of in the run-up to the election, talking about some of the, I guess, issues that might have had an impact. And one of the issues we were talking about over the summer, we were hearing about, was the abortion access issue, the question, and there was some indication that there might be a huge impact. And yet we're looking at numbers in Texas statewide that it does not seem to have had an impact. I think that some would have thought it might earlier this year. Any analysis on that, or why would that have not been the case in Texas, do you think?
Well, it seems that some of the voters are more concerned with inflation and price of homes and things and getting by in Texas, more important than an abstract issue that may or may not affect you in the future. So they're really voting with their pocketbooks, it seems to me.
Yeah, I would agree with Jay on that. I mean, I think that you almost have a two-tier voting system, or not tier, but kind of a bifurcated voting system, where you have a lot of folks who are after a lot of social issues and things of that nature with the women's reproductive rights and things that kind of lean on those sides of things. And then you have a voting public that goes and like Jay said, votes with their pocketbooks and looks at what the Texas economy is doing and what we're about to go into as far as surplus numbers go with the legislative session, with those of who have been in charge for some time, and kind of what is happening with the growth in Texas. And so it's not to discount one over the other or kind of choose favorites. I think you have two different types of voters. I mean, I think you have one who is looking at the types of things that Jay spoke of, and then others who seem to get a lot of the media attention and the social media attention and things of that nature. But when it comes to those early voting days or those Tuesdays of the actual election, it seems, at least as we've seen, where it comes out in a different format.
That's what kind of led me, the surprise to me by the margin of victory for the statewide. I've talked to a lot of women in particular that are very upset about the Roe v. Wade being overturned, and told me that they had voted for Republicans in the past and they weren't going to do it anymore. So whether they changed their mind or I'm just talking to a particular set of people, I don't know, but it kind of led me to believe that some of those races would be closer.
Well, I thought that too, but then when I went back and we all looked at the results, and in the governor's race, for example, if you compare the results when Beto O'Rourke in this election and Lupe Valdez several years ago, in this election, Governor Abbott got 55.5% of the vote, and Mr. O'Rourke got 43.2% of the vote. Lupe Valdez election, Governor Abbott got 55.81%, and Lupe Valdez got 42.51%. Now, what I find remarkable about that is the amount of resources that Mr. Beto enjoyed versus the amount of resources that former Sheriff Valdez had at her disposal, and it was enormously in the favor of Mr. Beto, and yet it didn't get any, really, it got just a marginally higher percentage of votes.
I think we're also coming to a time with social media and a lot of the electronic media that we have where folks are maybe not fatigued, but they certainly are saying, I'm going to think on a different scale. Like maybe I'm not going to believe everything that's coming through my phone, and they're going to think on their own feet with it. And I think that perhaps that made a difference. And also with the statewide is we had redistricting as well. And if you look at what typically happens with that is that the districts are drawn in such a way with the majority in power to provide for more fruitful elections coming up. And I think that possibly played a factor in it as well.
That's a good point. So probably more competitive races down ballot this year because of redistricting than there were on the ballot when Sheriff Valdez ran. That's a good point.
Yep. Yeah. But the amount of money is extraordinary that's going into these races. I looked at the elections or the ethics commission and kind of looked at a top 10 and not only loans to individual candidates. I mean, it is a financial machine that is taking place. You're talking about 27 million raised and spent and things like this. I mean, they're pretty extraordinary numbers. I mean, people are kind of going at this at all costs in order to win these seats and to win them by a significant margin so they can stay in them.
Well, one of the interesting things on the fundraising side, if you go to Beto O'Rourke's campaign, for example, he raised an enormous amount of money. And roughly about almost 50% of that was from out of state. And which doesn't surprise me, because if you reach back into history, you remember whenever there was $60 million that's put into those state house races a couple of cycles ago, and 60% of that, 80% of that money was from outside the state of Texas, because we all know that Texas is seen as a state that if it turns Democratic control, that it's believed then that, of course, the electoral votes will flow to the Democratic presidential nominee.
And they certainly wanted to flip the House to Democrats,
right,
so that prior to redistricting,
yes,
so they get better lines.
That's exactly right.
And there's also now this question of polling versus social media, and how much. I mean, many people tend to pay attention to social media and are saying polling doesn't matter anymore, and it's just very difficult. I mean, it's almost like trying to predict what's going to come up on your Instagram feed or your Facebook feed or something along those lines. It's very similar to what's going on in these elections now. They're just all over the place. And something to Mike's point is that have we over customized too much, right? Have we over customized the message too much? Have we given too much individuality on these issues for somebody to just lob onto? It's like being behind that person at a buffet who hasn't eaten in some time. I mean, they really want to go through every single item. And I just don't think that where we are as a society and our attention spans can stay focused that long. And so it's really interesting. And how many people are doing their own research on these candidates beyond just what they're being told to vote for.
What are your takes on the polls that we were seeing in the days up to the election?
Local?
Well,
National?
I think national are the polls that folks might have been more attuned to, but statewide as well.
Well, I listened to a gentleman who had been deputy chief of staff for President Obama, and he was commenting on how wrong the polls have been 4 cycles, 4 elections in a row. And I don't know whether or not people honestly answer the polls. I don't know whether or not people are afraid to say what they think in a poll, but they certainly don't seem to be accurate. And what I have found in talking to candidates, and perhaps Jay and Brinton have done this too, their internal polls seem to be more accurate than the ones that are taken by the news media. And
I talked to a Democrat state elected official last week, and asked him how things were going. He said it's going to be bad. So the polling he was looking at, he knew it was going to be bad. Also, I heard from the governor's team had seen polls between 4 and 12% win, and it came in on the high end of that. So I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I would put it to you this way, Rick. I mean, what I do know, they now have my cell phone and they now have my email address, and I get hit 24/7, especially around this time, as we all do. And what I do know is what I do with that information. I mean, it's probably what's happened into the telemarketing and direct marketing industry. As soon as Apple started popping up that this could be a telemarketer, you just don't answer the phone. I mean, and so I look at it in a way that the general public's getting smarter around some of these things, and they're not going to answer those polls as readily available. And it is interesting on the candidate side, like, what are these guys doing different? Maybe a smaller focus group from kind of some key folks within the district. I mean, typically they know their district very well, and they would be able to know who kind of the influencers on the ground, not just in the virtual world.
Well, and I had the same experience as Jay, but with regard to in the lieutenant governor and the attorney general's race, is that their polls were framed in the same way, that it was going to be 4 to 12%, and it came in on the high side. But one thing we might want to mention is what happened in South Texas. In South Texas has been very interesting. One of the things that happened in the state house was Janie Lopez, a Republican, made history in House District 37, where she was the first Hispanic Republican woman elected to the state house from the Rio Grande Valley. The other thing that's a first is that Ryan Guion, who I think that y'all know, had switched parties. In 2021, he won all but one county in his district as a Republican, with between 55% and 92% of the vote. He won his South Texas home county, Starr County, with 70% of the vote. He's the first Republican to ever win in Jim Hogg County, the first since 1904 in Duval County, the first since 1892 in Starr County. And that was pretty remarkable in that in the valley.
What's interesting, it's really a matter of semantics in some ways, because when you look back, let's go back a couple of generations. Texas was a big D state.
Mm-hmm.
People haven't changed. The party national identity changed, but the core values of people have not changed. And so we get sort of caught up, I think, in whether one is a Republican or a Democrat. And I think we're sort of watching that transition here in Texas. And I think there's sort of an identity crisis, perhaps, in one party or the other or both, but certainly in terms of how to communicate with people from South Texas.
Well, I think too, in this instance, there's a group in the state of Texas called Associated Republicans of Texas, which is a PAC, that's gone out and aggressively identified and recruited candidates to Hispanic candidates to run in South Texas, and it's paid, and their efforts have paid dividends. The number of Republican women in the state house grew by 7 seats, and also they grew the number of minority legislators by 6 seats, which is really significant gains in the Hispanic community in particular.
So what's the lesson here? I mean, moving forward, what's the takeaway from this?
I think one of the big questions is how much Texas is willing to be part of the national conversation, because there's an incredible amount of national influence that comes in during these races, including in Tarrant County, something as local as that. It's kind of the crown jewel and what was deemed as moving purple. And I think a lot of folks thought that, and then somehow came back around and what Texas does is go down every other year and really does work together. I mean, it is one that, yes, there are all kinds of things that occur on a partisan level, but overall, I think, as you stated, that I think Texans just operate a little bit differently. It's just, they kind of, I would say, put their best foot forward and rise above a lot of the national partisan things that are going on and do what's best for Texans. And I think that's very important, and why we have civil elections the way we do in this state still, where there's not a lot of consternation over, voting, ballot box, who happened with this. There's an understanding and a respect for, I think, our processes here. You okay with me saying that?
I wasn't listening.
Okay.
Okay. I was going to say, one other takeaway, I agree with you, is the Republicans are not ceding South Texas any longer. So Michael was talking about they spent a lot of time and effort down there recruiting candidates to run as Republicans. You've had a lot of Democrats down there who haven't been faced a Republican in a long time. And even the statewide are dedicated to that. You saw that Governor Abbott had his victory celebration in McAllen last night. He had lots of places he could have had that in Texas, and he chose McAllen. So,
Well, and Ryan Guillaume, when he switched parties and they had that event at the Capitol, he was surrounded by a number of his Republican colleagues. And the other thing that was interesting about that was when he ran in the Republican primary, he won with nearly 57% of the vote. And that was really a huge moment, because then some of his some of the people who currently are Democrats can look at that and see, I could switch parties and I could be just fine. And because they know, if they've got the same kind of values as Representative Guillaume, and they know that they may get run out, they may get primaried from somebody on the far left. And that's happened to Henry Cuellar, for example, on 2 different occasions. And Mr. Cuellar is a stellar individual, won his primary by only 177 votes. I did very well in the general election.
Let's talk a little bit about, we were discussing again, also leading up to the elections, what's happening in Florida. You said was, huge win for DeSantis. And conversely, we were talking about quality of candidates and candidates that were, handpicked by, Donald Trump. What does this portend for Donald Trump's political future?
I was just reading a note that I had written about kind of what I see is happening. And based on those comments about Texas, and what you see is a real respect for the process of government, and the process that has been in place for a long time, with the way that we come up with laws and policies, and having a respect for that. And so what happens is you have a lot of folks who have never really paid attention to that, much less stepped inside of any kind of a governmental capacity and taken the time to learn about that and how that is. It's been more of an outside viewpoint. And, we were talking earlier, Mike talked about governors being great as far as the launching pad for presidents. You have to run very large states and budgets and all of these things. And then there's a respect for how you get there. There's a whole other animal to this now, which is, how are you going to get there? And I think some people fall prey to, the methodologies on how to get there, and rather than getting in there and respecting the process. So I think we still have a lot to work out with this era that we're in of how important it is to get there and all costs to get there. But then once we're there, are we going to respect the processes in place in order to kind of move forward? And I would hope that folks could choose a candidate and really think about that, not just who they are on the campaign trail and all of the campaign promises and what they say, but really when they get in there, are they going to be able to do what they say that they're going to do and come through for the benefit of everyone? Because once you're there, I believe that you have a responsibility for all who you represent. So.
Well, I agree with that. Frankly, in seeing the DeSantis victory over Charlie Crist, where he won by nearly 20%, and that was a huge improvement over his previous race, and where he edged out his Democratic challenger in that previous gubernatorial race. And the speech that he gave, at least what I heard of it, made him sound frankly, presidential. And it was as if for me, it was watching a shift in leadership in the Republican Party where Mr. DeSantis, who I think is the strongest potential rival to if former President Trump decides to run again, but Mr. DeSantis was very, very good. And I think people, there was a quote from a GOP mega donor by the name of Ken Griffin, and I would say this is a shift. At least he said, for a litany of reasons, I think it's time to move on to the next generation. And that's why I think Mr. DeSantis is well positioned for 2024. You could even hear in his acceptance speech last night that people were saying 2 more years instead of 4 more years. So it seems like they were conceding that he would probably be a presidential candidate.
It was a very bad night. President Trump, I think it was a week ago or so, excuse me, there were pictures of Trump and Carrie Lake. That was going to be the ticket for 2024. And she's in a tight race in Arizona, probably going to lose that. The other candidates that he handpicked, like Dr. Oz in the Senate, and Herschel Walker, and whoever else, didn't have much luck last night.
They didn't. And in Ohio, for example, I believe in Ohio, Governor DeWine won by around 25% of the vote. J.D. Vance, who came out of the primary and was not a strong candidate, particularly on the fundraising side, for example, he had only raised $12 million. And the Senate Leadership Fund, which is aligned with Senator McConnell, came in and put $32 million in that race because J.D. Vance was not able to raise the money from, I guess you'd call them the usual Republican donors. And that was a big difference because McConnell rescued him, but it was also having that big win by DeWine that helped pull him up. I think the thing in Georgia, for example, Brian Kemp won handily with 8%. And now that helped Herschel Walker, but now they're in I don't know where they are.
They're going to have a runoff on December 6th.
Okay.
But I think there was a lot of people that came in and voted for the governor of Georgia who either didn't vote for Herschel Walker or voted for his opponent.
Right.
Like about 200,000 folks, I want to say.
That's a lot.
A lot of drop-off.
A lot of drop-off.
Yeah, I noticed that even at the county level, where there was a total of 592,000 votes, but then only 582. People are starting to do that too, where they're simply not voting for people if they're not familiar with them on the ballot. Typically, I will get calls and people say, "Who do I vote for here and here and here?" And so in many ways, the fact that we're just talking about it and talking about some of the issues that all of these candidates and elected officials are going to face in the upcoming years, it's a good thing. I mean, people are beginning to get engaged. Again, I'll go back to that almost 50%. I mean, that's good numbers for Tarrant County. I mean, it's been very much lower before.
Yeah, almost so much lower. We were talking about the candidates, that you mentioned, Jay, that did not fare as well. These are folks who had, large personalities or celebrities, really, for whatever reason, and yet didn't have the resume that you might expect in governance, as you were talking about, Brinton. So I think there's some lessons here. And in the next election cycle, should we expect to see maybe a better quality, better caliber of candidate, or is it too soon for that?
Well, we were discussing this earlier because, for the three of us, and I'll say this, and y'all correct me, but Jay and me in particular came up in politics in a period where the party itself was really the vetting mechanism. That's gone away. With the phenomena of independent expenditures, with super PACs, with mega donors, social media, people can go run. They don't have to go through that same process that you had a number of years ago. Certainly for me, when I first got involved in politics.
Yeah, there's very much of an individual versus party thing going on, and not even a party Republican or Democrat or Libertarian. I mean, it's more of a group of folks pushing someone or someone pushing themselves, and then having the other folks follow, right? Who chicken or egg type of deal. I'll be honest, I wasn't very familiar. I mean, I obviously knew who DeSantis was, but I never really looked that deep into it. And so I looked you asked about that type of candidate. I mean, like it or not, I mean, Yale graduate, Harvard Law, Navy, served the country. I mean, everything lines up there. Then with the education and the governance, and so there is this aspect of, oh wow, is this like the super candidate? Is this? I mean, checks all the boxes, kind of that many people may deem as this is somebody who should lead the country.
Well, he's turned Florida ruby red. I mean, you think back to the Bush Gore contest, where George Bush won that state by 500 votes. Well, it's a very different state now than what it was.
I think, to your point as well, and it makes me think of post-pandemic, people moving around this country, a lot of migratory patterns, and the census showed that. You almost question whether we're going to have states that become more not just a melting pot of people, but more of this type of state. And we're already seeing that. I mean, if you just talk to people, I mean, clearly Texas is a little bit more of a red state. Florida is the same way. And then are you going to have just, states that are less? And are people going to stop opening businesses there and that type of thing? I would argue that years ago that wasn't an issue. That wasn't something that's been brought to the forefront as much in people's decisions. They would say, perhaps the business leaders were saying that privately, but it didn't seem to be as evident or as visual as it is now.
Does that sound like a radical concept to you?
That people are moving to different states for
But
different
I mean,
things?
that it sort of seems to fly in the face of the United States of America.
Yeah. I mean, I do worry about that polarization that is occurring. That it's like, geez, when are we gonna? I'm sorry, I'm not gonna.
Ideologically,
it's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it is ideologically.
Well, you can see the difference between urban areas, which are even in the state of Texas, which are Democrat. In Dallas County, for example, usually it's about a 2-1 voter advantage. In general elections, Democrat versus Republican. And the same thing can be said some of the other urban, Houston, for example, Harris County. Then you get out and remember back when Cruz only won by 2.7% of the vote. And was that 2018? I believe that was 2018. It was West Texas that delivered the margin of victory for him.
Well, you raised a good point. My next question I was going to ask you, it seems that, Republicans did better perhaps than even some would have anticipated in Texas. What does that say? Is that a mandate? And what does that say for an agenda for Governor Abbott and for the State House? And what do you think that looks like?
Jay?
It's going to be very conservative legislature. They've got the green light to do what they want to do and what their voters are telling them they want done. So we're hearing things about hopefully property tax reductions, which has been difficult to solve over 20 years. Education, changes to public education, potentially vouchers. And who knows what kind of social issues will rise up this session.
So Brinton, earlier you were talking about how much money they got available?
Lots. I mean, Jay argued with me about it, but I mean, billions and billions. We're very fortunate in this state. I mean, we have, I heard the numbers of 20 something to 30 something, just kind of general, and then sitting 14 billion in the rainy day fund. Please don't those are very loose numbers. But we fortunately have a comptroller who won very handily, and who doesn't play a lot of the games, as the state CFO that has been played before. And so we're just on a really nice financial ship here. We're extraordinarily fortunate. I mean, this is, if you want to go to a state that has more money, I would argue, than anyone, that would be us. And I think, to Jay's point, some folks would like to just not spend any of that, and wait. And presumably that's maybe why we are in such good fortune, is because we've had a group of folks who have consistently said, save some money. You'd like to do that in your own house, I would think, and everyone would like to have the ability. The difference is that we may not take some things that are offered at the federal level, the Medicaid and CHIP expansion, things of that nature. So, and so it's kind of, okay, well, if that's going to happen, how are we going to do this? Some of the transportation initiatives, and infrastructure that we need to keep up with, because it's going to grow. People are going to, it doesn't take long for people to find out. I would imagine some people are going to move out to Altadena, California, where that guy won $2 billion in the Powerball, just to get a little close to him. So we will attract people, is kind of my thought there.
Well, since he's in California, you imagine how much tax he's got to pay on that. They've got the highest personal income tax in the country. Going back to the vouchers for a minute, one that has come up, on a number of occasions, but it's always been opposed by the rural school districts. And it's my understanding that this time that the approach will be a bracket bill in order to just isolate it for vouchers for the urban school districts.
Be interesting to see how that plays out. Anyone care to hazard a guess on anything that may or may not occur with abortion nationally, in the state of Texas, any further abortion rights? I don't think the issue's played out completely.
I don't know how that's going to work out, obviously, but something we do need to touch on is that the federal Congress is going to be closer. Likely the Republicans will have the House, and yet to be determined who will have the Senate. But that might make the middle, moderate people on both sides more the players to impact things, hopefully solve some problems. Whereas I mentioned earlier, Texas is going to continue the rightward leaning, which is fine. Hopefully the federal government will somehow work things out in the middle.
Yeah, Jay and I spoke about that before. Is just, the fact that there wasn't this red wave would maybe lead some to believe that there will be more of a middle and a centrist, because we're as close as we are in some of these races, that it's not necessarily a bad thing. That maybe there's more in the middle, and some debate and discussion around that. Mike doesn't like that answer at all. I don't.
Well, no, it's not that. It's I think in the House and the Senate, yeah, I think that's exactly possible. I think the fascinating part about this is that if you're the White House and it wasn't like whenever Obama had 64 seats that flipped. The White House may believe we've got the right message. Notwithstanding, this is the highest inflation we've had in 40 years. Notwithstanding the foreign policy challenges that the United States faces in Europe and also in the Pacific. So they may believe they've got the right message. So if that's the case, then you would think then that would encourage President Biden, who turns 80, I think, this month, to really really believe that I should go ahead and run again.
On that note, do you all think, because I tend to think this way, but I know you're the one supposed to ask the question.
Oh,
I got it.
all questions are welcome, please.
Do you think that happens with on the ballots when guys win or gals win by a certain amount, that I got 65%, I'm gonna push it a little more. This is my session, or this is my time to do this bill as a result of what my voter turnout and what my receipt of vote looks like. Do you agree with that or disagree that they take that same sentiment.
Oh, I think some people feel like they're bulletproof and that they can go ahead and advance a certain agenda to test that. But the proof in the pudding, as we all know, because we've worked in legislatures, that we know that really and truly it's whether or not you can find a majority of people to agree with you. And we all know that legislation is the art of the possible.
Well, does that become easier to do if the specter of Donald Trump is fading?
Which part?
Well, being able to reach across the aisle, negotiate, find a middle.
Depends on how nasty you were to your opponent, getting in there, I would say. I mean, a lot of it, I think, is who you are on that campaign trail. Because I think it comes back. I mean, I think that, from the Trump standpoint, I think it's all, on an individual level of how you run your campaign and then some of the issues you tackle when you're in those places.
I think certain styles encourage friendship and camaraderie, and other styles not so much. But I have noticed that there are people who are gracious in both in victory and in defeat, and I think that says a lot about their character. Because we know that in these races that people have hard-hitting ads, and they're not always kind in their ads to one another. And then hopefully they put that aside and are kind in both victory and defeat.
Well, it's been interesting run-up, and I feel like interesting race and election night, certainly. And 24 starts Monday?
No, it started last night. It started with this election.
Yeah,
kicks it off.
Like we're in the never-ending stage of election cycles, and to your point,
Yeah.
with the phone everywhere in your pocket, and ads are never-ending. The influence never ends.
It'll wear you out, I think. I remember before in one election, I guess it was the Clinton-Trump election. I decided I was turning off. I wasn't going to watch CNN or Fox or any of the other channels. And I thought, all I'm going to do is sports. All I'm going to do is watch sports. And then ESPN decided that it was going to weigh in on the election. And I thought, I've got to hold that control so I can keep hitting mute, because this is making me crazy.
You feel betrayed.
I know. I was trying to find an oasis of sanity in the middle of that election cycle.
Right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. And thank you. Unfortunately, no questions this time, but thank you for your time. And I look forward to bringing you the next webcast from Lunceford Web. Thanks.